The work I want to talk about today, this is kind of work in progress. Eileen Crimmins and I, we've been working together a little bit on what I would say generally is demography of dementia and cognitive aging. We joined forces a while back. We do a lot of joint work together, and we have oftentimes pull our lab groups together. So I'm assuming Yuan Zhang is in the audience. Yuan and I have worked together on a number of projects, and that's because we've joined our USC and Texas labs. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to start off here, and that way I can talk through. And I'm going to put it in presentation mode here. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually very simple. It's kind of one of those demography talks about let's get the facts straight, as opposed to let's make up stories about things that we imagine. And it grew out of a number of conversations that I had with Eileen and with Ken Lange at the University of Michigan. And it had to do with which way are the trends going in terms of the prevalence of dementia in the population, what's driving those trends, and I mean both socially and demographically, what's driving those trends. And we were surprised. I think it's kind of like when Bob and I were working on this issue of education and mortality, we were surprised about how little empirical work there was out there that I think you could trust at the national level. So we embarked on this project, and this is one of a number of papers that we've generated from the project itself. And this is actually the one on trends. We have other papers that are focusing on disparities. Two of my graduate students and I just got a paper accepted yesterday about how socioeconomic status combines over the life course to influence dementia life expectancy. So we're looking at a variety of components of the demography of dementia. This paper is collaborative with Matteo Farina, who's a former student and a postdoc of Eileen's at USC, and Yuan Zhang is a postdoc at CPC. So, and I knew her when she was at University of Southern California. Junki Kim is part of the lab group at USC, and then Eileen Crimmins. So the source of today's talk is a paper that we have gotten accepted recently, which is was surprisingly difficult to get accepted, but I think that's because people have different thoughts about how to think about trends, and I think that's one of the things that we were surprised about among the sociologists and demographers, where they weren't as well versed in thinking about what drives trends as opposed to what drives disparities. And so I think we learned a lot, and I'm going to circle back at the end in terms of thinking about what we learned in kind of larger lessons. I will say that there's another component to this paper. It's a more substantive component. I just finished a report with some colleagues at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, where we were tasked to set the kind of what would an agenda look like for social science research looking at dementia. So it was a decadal report, and we just put it out. And there were a lot of MDs, even though it was about social science. It's not surprising. There were lots of MDs on this panel or committee, and they were discussing these trends. And I will say that they were discussing the factors they thought that were responsible for the trends. And I will show you today that none of the factors that they thought were responsible for the trends are responsible for the trends. But it was one of those interesting conversations. I wanted to say, I think I know what's driving the trend, but I couldn't say until the paper was published because it made me nervous. I wanted to make sure that we had the evidence to back our claims up. So I put this slide in here because this is the slide that Alzheimer's Association uses to scare the hell out of Congress every year, so that when they want more money for aging-related diseases like Alzheimer's, they just show this projection of and why Alzheimer's is such a problem. And I would suggest that you put confidence bounds around these projections that are probably a little wider than you would anticipate. And the reason is that these are projections that are quite naive in terms of their underlying, the way they do the projections. They're basically taking the prevalence of what we have now, simply extrapolating it forward into what life will like as we have more older people. And so it's really a very simple-minded, age-based projection. It's not the kind of projection that increasingly other countries like the United Kingdom are turning to, which is incorporating the kinds of risk factors and changes in population composition that I think would provide a more informed approach to doing projections. In fact, the Alzheimer's Association asked me if I would develop some new projections for them, and when I said I would only do it under the conditions that we would look at risk factors over time and changing population composition, they became uninterested, which of course I became uninterested as well. So here's the background. These are kind of very simple facts that we have based on the Lange-Weir classification system that was developed for the HRS to classify people into dementia status. There was a decline in dementia prevalence between 2000 and 2012. It's pretty significant over a short period of time. You know, it's about 3% that had declined over that period. We finally know that there's a higher prevalence for non-Hispanic Blacks, and we don't really know how much of this is shared by other race groups, but I want to show you some work which I think was the best work up until recently, which is the decline in dementia prevalence by race ethnicity that was published by Chen and Julie Zissimopoulos from USC. What you can see here, I think, is really, really stark. If you look at the top line, you will see in terms of in 2000, the prevalence of dementia in the Black population was almost 26%, where if you looked at the white population, it was 9.9%. So there is a drastic race difference in what is going on in dementia. And I don't know why people don't talk about the race difference, because in my opinion, the issues are, these numbers show that the problem is epidemic among Black Americans, and we have simply been ignoring this for a long time. The disparities, the race disparities, don't seem to occupy a central part of the conversation that we have about dementia prevalence, dementia life expectancy, whatever you want to say about it. I won't comment on the Hispanic results simply because I have never learned how to interpret the Hispanic results in the HRS, given the validation of I'm not sure about the validation of the classification approach for that population. So the trends are downward, as you can see, and they're shared by all race groups. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about today about the idea that there is improved educational attainment in the population for the cohorts that we're looking at that is responsible for these dementia trends. And this has actually been alluded to for quite some time. You go back and you look at the epi work that's done by, let's say, Ken Lange at Michigan and other folks, I think, as well. The folks at Rush, for example, they were interested in this educational composition hypothesis, which is the idea that improvements in education, not a biomedical factor, but a social factor, the improvements in education over time were responsible for this. Now, it was alluded to, but I don't know why people never thought about looking at this in particular, but they didn't look at it empirically. So the other alternative hypotheses out there in the world, though, are we have improved childhood environment, which is true for the cohorts that we were looking at here in this analysis. There are declines in smoking rates, which smoking is a very strong risk factor for dementia. There was improved control of hypertension, and that's from a vascular dementia point of view. Certainly, we would have been expecting these kinds of factors to come into play. Now, in our contributions here, we're thinking in a number of ways. One is we actually have information about whether the trend has continued since 2012 into 2014, and it has. And I will tell you that although we have now incorporated 2016 information, even a longer time trend in the analysis, the trend is still continuing. So we're not seeing any deviation from the trend, I would say, from 2000 to 2016. What we weren't clear about, because a lot of the results earlier were age standardized, was whether the trend was concentrated in particular age groups. In essence, it's also a way to think about cohorts as well. I see Yang in my visuals, and so I can't help but think about cohorts when I have her in the audience here. So we're going to look at the trend within two age groups, 65 to 74 and 75 plus. And I will tell you, unlike when Anne and Angus first published that death to spare information, we do standardize within these age groups because there is some aging going on over time within these age groups. And given the downward trends for Blacks and whites, we assess whether education is a common explanatory factor for both of these groups. Now, why is education so important? I would say I think I know, but I am sure I have an incomplete understanding of the ways in which education is working, because I think we're still trying to figure out the pathophysiological and non-pathophysiological mechanisms that are linked between social factors such as education and dementia. Now, part of it is a kind of developmental component here, which is this idea that education does provide the foundation for cognitive abilities, and that's a well-known literature. And if you think about this, it's school is where we acquire all the new knowledge, we keep knowledge in mind. You've got this idea that schools are constantly challenging students cognitively. I use this to convince my graduate students that comprehensive exams are a really good thing for them. They hate comprehensive exams, of course. No graduate student has ever wanted to take comprehensive exams. And I said, what that exam process does for you is it's an intense period of time for learning. You're immersed in a really cognitively challenging environment, and you will not think the same way when you come out the other end, and that is usually true. The other part is that education actually occurs when, biologically speaking, there's a lot of cognitive development going on, and it's fast. So
I will tell you, I really don't know. Can you hear me? Did I just drop off here? Can you hear me? Okay, great.
So I can tell you that, well, we have some evidence that more education results in longer periods of development and increased. The marginal gain in development kind of peters off at some point, and we don't really have a good understanding of the way in which I would say the functional form of education is related with dementia risk, and I hope to have that paper done very soon. I am working on that because it tells you the marginal gains and what's going on, but also has insights into potential mechanisms that underlie these associations. So there's still a debate out there whether there's this peak cognitive whether it's really at the other end of education, which is the end of education where we actually begin to become literate and more cognitively challenged at the low end of the education distribution. Now, here's a wrinkle in some of the stuff about education. You guys probably know this better than me. You're at the University of North Carolina. You have been a long-standing center of excellence for the demography of the South. And but it's surprising to most people that think about race disparities and they think about and they use the HRS. One of the things they don't tend to think about is that 80% of our geriatric respondents in the HRS were born in the South. And that was a period of Jim Crow segregation. I actually wrote on the slide a racialized caste. And I think when I first got into the work on disparities, I don't think I had a deep appreciation for what caste system means and how it can become embodied in ways that are phenomenally different, I think, than current institutions of racial discrimination. So I think this racialized caste system matters in an enormous and unusual way for older African Americans. Now think about this. We almost have a constant when it comes to race, and this is not something we're used to thinking about, I think. It's an era, the cohorts that are represented here are part of the era of the Great Migration, the tail end especially of Blacks from the South to the North. There was white migration too, especially from Appalachia. We forget about the fact that the epidemiologic environments for Black Americans were quite different than they were for whites, and that they have very high infectious disease rates in southern cities, and that potentially sets off an inflammatory process that can have long-term consequences for dementia later on, especially through things like early life brain development. The other factor that people have speculated on, and I think this is Maria Gleamore and Jen Manley at Columbia and Maria's at CSF, is this idea that unequal education experiences potentially lead to differences in risk. And the idea is behind this is that segregated schools, de facto and de jure, the less funding of Black schools, and actually less exposure to education during the school year mattered in ways that would make education less efficacious for Blacks, and essentially they would get fewer benefits from that educational experience and keep them lagging behind. It's an interesting hypothesis. It's one that makes sense. Every parent in the room knows that we want our kids to go to school longer. That summer recess, we're always worried about them losing information over the summer break. So this idea is kind of embedded in all of us about more school is better. I'll tell you, I'll just cut to the chase right now. Maria and Jen and our team don't find evidence of this. It is surprising, and I can talk to you at some point about what we think is going on. So here we have the data. Many of you know the Health and Retirement Study. We're looking at 2000 to 2014. We couldn't get the 2016 data in time before we published this work. We've limited the sample to 65 years of age and older, non-Hispanic Blacks, non-Hispanic whites. And the reason, of course, is that the Hispanic part and the Native part nativity issue is a factor that clouds interpretation, and that certainly is a factor that clouds interpretation of the ways in which population composition and things like education matter for the trend. actually looking at a dichotomy, a cognitive status dichotomy, which is with or without dementia. And we get this information, or HRS gets this information, from both proxy and self-respondents, because a lot of the HRS respondents who are older and frail end up in nursing homes. Now, I've given you, you don't need to pay too much attention to this slide, but I want to make a point here, and the point is that we're trying to get people classified in dementia. We're not trying to give everyone a fine score in a cognitive assessment, because it's some point. It is impossible to get that fine score for people that have dementia in a significant way or can't respond. So what we're really doing here, in order to assess dementia prevalence, we're really trying to get people into a classification scheme that is that reliably classifies people in a valid way in the population, and so that there's a long history behind how the HRS went about this. But I have a lot of respect for the work that they did, and while there is a little slippage, I think the results are highly consistent with other kinds of neuroassessment studies. Now, we didn't do any rocket science here, because I've stopped doing rocket science, I think, sometimes. We estimated logistic regression equations to look at the effects of sex and age and observation wave, and we stratified by two age groups here. We fit the models on a total population separately for the race groups, and then we added education to see how education composition changed the trend. So we have these, the overall trend between 2000 to 2014. Now, we did a lot of macronations here to make sure that we could use a continuous measure to capture the period between 2000 and 2014. We looked at non-parametric specifications of the trend and that kind of thing. And so I'm pretty sure, if you have this in mind, are we kind of overreaching in the data? Our linearization term captures the trend really, really well for the two groups. So what I have here is a pretty simple graph. The top line is the black line, black solid line, is the dementia prevalence change between 2000 and 2014 from that stylized equations, and it's downward, as you can see. Then we controlled for education, and the dotted line shows what happens when we control for education. And when we control for education, the prevalence of dementia actually went up in this age group, African Americans, 75 years of age and older. Now, the other lines are harder to see because there's less, things become less obvious at the lower prevalence rates. I'll show you actual numbers in a minute, but all those solid green lines and solid orange lines and solid blue lines are all downward. And every time you control for education, that line, the prevalence line, flattens towards zero, as again, no trend. So I'm going to ignore the dark estimates for a minute. So what I'm showing here is the relative annual change in percent in dementia prevalence between 2000 and 2014. And so an example is for whites 65 to 74, on average, there was a decline of 3.8% in dementia prevalence over that period. And you'll see that there was a decline for white 75 and older, 2.7. For blacks 65 to 74, there was an average decline of 5.2%. And then for blacks 75 years of age and older, there was a decline of 1.4%. Now here's the first exercise, which is model 1. We add education, and I showed you those dotted lines earlier, and the lines move right back towards zero. So all of a sudden you add education and the line changes significantly towards zero for whites, younger whites. It does the same for older whites, and it does the same for younger blacks especially, and it even increases the prevalence rates when we control for education for older blacks. So you can see that the effect of education here is really large in terms of the relative annual change. Then we actually just went back and re-estimated model 1, which is this trend, and we added some measures of childhood disadvantage and childhood health problems to control for those. And you can see that the trend does flatten somewhat. For whites, it's flattened somewhat for blacks, but not as much as education is doing. Nonetheless, I think there is a little bit of a story here, which is that there's a bunch of change that occurs in the dementia prevalence trend when we start controlling for early life factors, and especially education. Now here are all the risk factors that my friends who are MDs on this National Academy panel thought would be the absolute explanations for the trends. So here's, let's just take model 4. So there's the 3.8% decline in trend. It's exactly the same as the trend without controlling for smoking. And in fact, if you notice across that line, basically controlling for smoking doesn't do anything. Either does controlling for BMI, either does controlling for diabetes, heart condition, stroke, or hypertension. It's a little surprising because all of those factors, trust me, are risk factors. They are risk factors for dementia, I can guarantee it. They do not explain the trend. And I think that is something to think about in this context. Risk factors for differences and disparities are not necessarily the same things that drive trends in the population. So I couldn't wait to show this result to some of my colleagues. So I'm going to come back here. This is the real story here, which is about the results for education. Now, I thought it instructive for us to actually look at how much education composition should change in a very short period of time. So if you look at non-Hispanic blacks, the third line down, at 2000, the average education was 10.2 years. If you look in 2014, they'd already gained 2.2 years of education, which is a lot for that group. Now, the same is true in general for all of the demographic groups that we're looking at, is that we saw a very large increase in the levels of education. What this graph doesn't show you is where in the education distribution that change is coming from, but I will tell you that mostly the change is coming from improved education at the low end of the distribution. It's not really being driven by changes in education composition among the college educated. So I'm hoping to wrap up here pretty quickly so that we don't have to, if you have questions, I can try to answer them. We have declines in prevalence that are consistent with other studies, and they're steepest for blacks 65 to 74. I did not anticipate that, I didn't know, but I'm glad I began to look within age categories. The other thing we found is that in this analysis is pretty simple-minded. Education dampened or reversed the trend, and that there was no evidence that other dementia risk factors mediated or mattered for the recent trends, which I actually was surprised at. So I want to reference prevalence history a little bit because I am a life course demographer. The declines in prevalence here, we're really talking about non-medical changes. If you wanted to move the needle, if you think about improving quality of life and dementia risk in the population, where would you turn to make a difference here? It's not medical for these cohorts. It's in 1910 to 1940, we have what Claudia Goldin called the second great transformation of American schooling. If you don't know Claudia Goldin's work, I recommend reading it. I mean, I think economic history is really important for us to understand, and Claudia is one of the best economic historians that I know. She's just amazing the way she thinks. The growth in college education occurred mostly in the second half of the 20th century. There's been some new things in the news recently about gender differences and how women have surged ahead in college degrees compared to men. I ask you to keep that in mind for what might happen in the future in terms of gender disparities. In this, we really didn't find gender disparities much in this analysis. And it's unclear how much I think education will matter for future developments. Partly it is, we've made the jump from low educated to higher educated population. We don't yet know how higher education is really tied into dementia very well, and part of it likely will be the way in which education is linked to the changing nature of work, which offers cognitive challenges throughout the adult lifespan. So what I'm saying is that if you think that the world is in equilibrium, it is not in equilibrium. And my way of thinking about this is that future projections, if we're going to get into projections here, they should incorporate information on educational changes, but also other factors. So when I say what's going to happen in the future with regard to smoking or diabetes or all the other risk factors that we saw, and I'm pretty sure those risk factors are likely to matter for future cohorts, just not these cohorts who have a different history and a legacy that we have to position these cohorts in a specific historical context. And I think we have to get a little bit more sophisticated about what the historical contexts are. So here's a few lessons I've learned. And I point this out, there's a recent paper in Demography written by Anna Zanchikova and Hannah, I can't remember Hannah's last name, Goralchik, I think. They wrote this lovely paper on the demography of pain trends. And one of the things they point out, and I was delighted that they pointed out in that paper, was that the factors that are associated with differences in disparities are not necessarily the same factors influencing the trends. And that's clearly true here with respect to dementia. Cohorts can differ pretty dramatically because of rapid sociopolitical factors at the macro level. I think that's true for American mortality now. I think that's true for dementia because of early life factor changes. The point is that I think that we tend to think of trends as being glacial. But I can tell you when you look at mortality trends, they are not glacial, they are fast. They're much faster than we would anticipate. I think that's also the case with dementia trends. The other thing I think we ought to think about in outcomes such as dementia, which is such an aging-related condition that really is hinged a lot to developmental processes early in life. I think we have to begin to think about developmental processes and how they leave their stamp on the population as it survives into old age. So those are the kinds of lessons learned that we've learned from this study, and I think other studies as well. But I think working with Bob taught me a lot about making sure that we truly get the facts right when we're talking about these kinds of issues, I can tell you that people care about the specific numbers. You know, it's not like I have some dependent variable where people are going, oh, it's greater or lesser than. No, people want to know the specific numbers here, and policies and people's lives will be affected by those numbers. Oops. And I have to acknowledge the support that I've gotten from both the National Institute on Aging and ICHD. So I think I'll stop there. I intended to make this a shorter talk, so let's see if anyone's.
Mark, thank you. That was fantastic. This is Elizabeth. I'm going to try to moderate the Q&A and so that it doesn't just get too out of control. If you guys can put your name in the chat, I'll just call on you sequentially. And I know that Claire Yang has the first question. So Claire, please unmute yourself and go right ahead. And we'll...
Oh, hi, thank you. I'm glad that I'm the first one to ask the question. Mark, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I specifically appreciate your mentioning at the beginning of the importance of our of us as demographers to you know, commit ourselves to getting the facts straight. I think sometimes it's underrated kind of research practice. It's absolutely, you know, what this study did just that. Well, I really appreciate that. My question has to do with your choice of using prevalence estimates for the study, given that prevalence rates typically come from cross-sectional data that you know, measure stock instead of flow. And then you have excellent 7 waves of longitudinal data from HRS that give not only stock but also flow. So in this case, it's also you know, possible to estimate incidence. So to the extent that it's possible, I wonder whether you've done parallel or additional supplement studies on incidence. And if yes, do the results of, you know, prevalence in terms of the role of education translate also to incidence? And if not, you know, what else, you know, what do you think the prevalence study will inform us of the incidence? Now, the background of my question very quickly is that my team is currently doing also studies of dementia, slightly different topics. But one study also used HRS linked with Adams data to look at actual diagnosis through in-person evaluation. And so we looked at age trajectories of cognitive change in relation to incidence of dementia. And then we found very surprisingly different role, you know, compared to our hypothesis of education on incidence. Right. So I'm just wondering what you have done with regard to that topic, and you know, you can just share with us.
Yeah, for the trend, we've actually done a similar analysis, but we can't be as fine-grained about it because of the instability of the incidence estimates themselves. And so there's a lot of noise that's in the data, but we have estimated the incidence for the total population, and we've looked at the ways in which education plays a role, and it's exactly what's driving the prevalence rates are the changes in the incidence rates themselves, which is not a surprise. It's not really, during that time period, mortality for people didn't really change by dementia status, so it really wasn't a mortality story here. It really was an incidence story. The other thing to think about, I mean, I always have these, I wish I had these images that I could just project to the screen. When we're looking at a trajectory of cognitive ability, you know, you start at young and you gain in terms of cognitive ability. You go out into adulthood, and then at some point in late adulthood, you begin to decline. But those lines can be quite irregular. I don't think we have an idea about, if you were to try and see what those lines looked for every individual in the population, you would be quite fascinated. But for us, generally as the groups, that incidence is really the race. It's a combination of how much you carried forward in your early life in terms of cognitive ability, and also the kind of trajectory of decline. So there's a lot of, as you know, Claire, there's a lot of debate about trajectories of decline, how it's related to incidence. I'm glad you're doing that work. Most of the work that I would say most of the stuff that we have done is consistent with the carrying forward of the stock. It's not as consistent. There is a less consistent story of early life factors with the race. Once decline starts, how steep is their trajectory? So I would say the real gain from early life and the real gain from education is really the stock of cognition. And you see that if you look at the race groups, we're already thinking about what's the prevalence of dementia for Black Americans that are 65 years of age. It's like 9 or 10%, right? I mean, we have a process that's already fast moving in the population that's left its stamp at 65 years of age on Black Americans is astronomically higher. This is all stuff coming from, it's not stuff that's happening, right proximate probably. That's not to take away physical activity. It's not to take away other, social support. All those risk factors, all those kind of social factors, they are indeed related to the pace at which declines occur. And I think that matters. So it's really how do these factors combine both the stocks and the declines? This is where I think the life course perspective is so important. But we're also still figuring out mechanisms, because I will tell you, I'm twigged about, the fact that like when we're looking in the life course, when we throw in disease as a possible pathway that connects these early life factors, and disease does nothing to mediate, it just adds more in terms of explanation of heterogeneity, but does nothing to mediate early life. That's so contrary to everything that we normally think about in terms of mortality or functioning, as an example. So cognition and cognitive aging is a different animal, and we have to recognize it, can't we? We can't just take this concept off the shelf and say, oh, we can operate it like a nuclear power plant. It's like mortality. It's like, no, it has its own ideology, and I think we're still uncovering that.
Thank you very much. I strongly agree with the perception that it's the carrying over of the stock that is driving the phenomena. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And we have a paper, that incidence paper is coming out. Maybe it's already published.
Thanks, Mark. I'm gonna, Bob Hummer has a question.
Mark, thank you as always. Fabulous. It's such a lesson about composition and history too, and how that's been so influential in understanding this change in prevalence. So my question has to be, you talked a bit about the educational change at the lower end, and you showed that kind of mean changes there for the different groups, and that was really instructive. And then you speculated a little bit about what might be coming ahead, that maybe the changes in dementia could be more strongly associated with health, with obesity, with diabetes, hypertension looking forward. But I also wonder, I just wanted you to speculate a bit about continued educational changes looking ahead in the next few decades at the higher end. We've continued to see these shifts, especially for women, more so for Blacks than for whites at higher end and so forth. And I wonder if I could get your thoughts on older ages too, so maybe the changes you've seen in HRS to now have been more pronounced with education at 65 to 74. But looking ahead, what about 85 plus and higher end, so what would be your hypotheses about continued educational change and how it's evolved across the 20th century, and what might be happening with dementia prevalence and changes at the older ages?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that Eileen and I disagree, but we're going to go find out. Okay, we're going to see. I'm more of the optimist, where the continued educational improvements will play an important role in declining prevalence and incidence of dementia. So I would say that partly I'm more optimistic is that in the cohorts that we were looking at, we don't have as many people, with those levels of education. And they're also in different kinds of jobs and challenges, and it's not always clear what the cognitive skills were that they learned when they were young. So I will say that. And so I think we're in uncharted territory. I don't think we have enough information to say confidently that education will continue, but my bet is that it will, that upper levels of education will matter, because if you see how far people can build the stocks of cognition, that is something that I think we forget about. Education really does matter, even into the young adult years. And so I don't want to dismiss that. And we haven't seen those people yet come along in our data. They don't exist yet in our data. So, but I want to say that we should be thinking about them moving forward. And as I think one of the things we're doing now is we're trying to be careful about looking at the functional forms, pulling out to the extent that we can changes in the functional forms, as you and I have done, because you learn a lot about the functional forms and the different processes that are coming into play. So for an example, I'm trying to get the data to look in a way that I test whether advanced education matters more recently than it did in the past. So that is an example of something that I'm looking for, just a signal. And I don't know if the data have enough signal yet for us to really determine what's going on. So I'm going to bequeath this to my great-grand students. So
thank you.
Takes a while for these cohort events to come through.
Good. I'm glad you're not giving up on education. That's
oh my God, are you kidding? That's the master variable in my life. and I think you made it so.
Okay, thank you. And Cassandra Davis is up next.
Yes, hello, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. When I saw the title of it, I was really excited to listen. Dementia has more of a personal connection within my family. My grandmother was a woman of color, passed away, she had dementia. My other grandmother was a Black woman, she also passed away, she also had dementia. So it is an unfortunate topic that is common in my household. So kind of with that, and also a little bit with the comment that was said right before mine. We know kind of historically that women surpassed men in receiving higher ed degrees around the 70s. So it really would be interesting to continue to see to what extent that trend kind of changes for if you plan to look at men and women in a few years from now. But my question is more focusing on men and women. Were you able to look at the gender differences within races? Just thinking about the historical implications, what schooling looked like for the different races, but also genders. Did anything really kind of stick out for you in your findings?
We don't have a gender pop at all, pretty much for what we're looking at, which is kind of surprising for us. But I always hesitate when we don't find that result. Don't say, "Oh, it doesn't exist."
Right.
I just didn't find evidence of it for these cohorts, and I'm still trying to figure out situationally how I think about some of these. So I'll give you an example. I'll just give away some of the thunder and some of the other stuff I'm doing. So this issue about race and education, how it doesn't pay off for Blacks, right, for dementia. Let me tell you, it pays off in the biggest way ever. So it's actually either equal to or a bigger effect for Blacks than it is for whites. The gradient is really high. And so, and when you look at race differences in dementia, they're the smallest at the upper levels of education. So as you move up, and if you think about what's going on in mortality, it's the opposite case, right? So that the race differences in mortality are the smallest at low levels of education and the greatest at higher levels of education. So education is doing something differently with respect to cognitive aging than it is with respect to physiological aging. We were really surprised by this because Maria and Jen's work is so profound, and conceptually it makes so much sense. And then we went and looked at the Halsey data, which are data that are from the South African HRS, right? And so you have a group of Black South Africans that were raised in apartheid. And it is exactly the same pattern for the Blacks in South Africa as it is for Blacks raised in Jim Crow. So all the things that how we think about the brain ought to work, and how it ought, and the lessons learned, we ought to be very careful in terms of how we think about things are working. We don't want to jump to any kind of assumptions. And I think this is what this has taught us, especially when it comes to race and education. Gender, though, I am sicking one of my graduate students on the gender issues, because I think this is so neglected in so many ways, in so many aspects of health, that it's driving me crazy. And so there's a void here. I think cognition, we're looking at cognition issues as well. So, but they're not as easy to pick up. The signals are not as strong.
Mm-hmm. And now, I mean, the last thing that I'll quickly say, even just thinking of course, it's two samples, right? It's two cases that I'm speaking from experience. But the one case was a woman who had an advanced degree, a graduate degree, and she had obviously the resources to get tested and was tested early, and we found out early. The other one did not have a high school diploma, and so we found it much later. And so really, understanding the difference between the resources and access that come with that extra education. So
it's huge. It's huge.
Right.
The other thing I want to say, though, is if the counterfactual for your relative who had the advanced education is, if she hadn't had the advanced education, that's the counterfactual, right?
Mm-hmm.
When would she have gotten that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we want to make sure we have the right comparison group in running that counterfactual. And I will say that on my National Academy group, every single one of us, we had a personal stake in what we were doing. So, how you have these little academic discussions, these were not academic. These are quite personal, knockdown dragouts. So, we're talking about real people here. And I think that's, even though sometimes as demographers, we lose sight and we have these large numbers, we're really talking about real people and moving the needle, I think, which is the other part, and making sure that life is better. So anyway, I get off on these things and I get a little evangelical.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks, Mark and Cassandra. I'm going to slip in one last question before we wrap up. Mark, I'm wondering, one of the various mechanisms through which education could be operating. I wonder if you've looked at all about occupation or degree of control over work during work life as a possible factor.
Yeah, we have it, and we don't pick up a lot of nothing that happens in later life explains the education effect. So we've done a lot of life courses. We've got some papers that are about to be under review, a lot of life course studies where we're looking at childhood, how does childhood weigh into plus education, plus later life, socioeconomic exposures, activities, that kind of thing. What we have is a model that we are coming to grips with, which sociologists usually hate, but it's a model that the body never forgets the exposures. So if you were in a bad childhood, you pick up the risks from that. If you got a good education, well, you added the good risks from that. If you got, great occupation, you got a good risk from that. But the mediating mechanisms are quite surprising because we don't have a lot of mediation from education in terms of later life. That is what surprised us. Usually as social scientists, we're looking for these kind of mediating processes, and I would say they're certainly not what we have measured in the data. So now I will say we thought that they would be, I'm not sure how much I can say about some of this stuff because it's under review, but we've been looking at education in relationship to pathophysiological mechanisms like inflammation, and so I'll just leave it at that. But we're testing out some ideas, but anyway.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, Yuan is my co-conspirator, so Carolina is just so.
We shall interrogate her later. All right. Well,
She's nice.
oh, I will. Thank you. This was absolutely wonderful. Great to have you. And I hope we're going to get you out here in person, maybe when things calm down a little more. And I think that really helps us wrap up our first seminar for the series. So big round of applause.
Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mark.
for having me.
Good to see
Appreciate
you.
it.
Take care.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.